At 67 years old, Walter Hayes thought he had seen just about every bad idea a farmer could make. Then 3 brewery trucks turned through his gate, one after another. They backed across the gravel yard and raised their beds. 40 tons of wet spent grain came sliding out. Heavy, steaming, sour-sweet. By the time the last truck pulled away, the pile was taller than Walter's tractor hood. The driver leaned out his window and looked at the old man standing there in muddy boots. "You sure you want all that?" Walter didn't answer. He walked toward the pile, crouched down, and pushed one bare hand into it. The grain was still warm. To the brewery, it was waste they needed gone. To Walter's neighbors, it looked like 40 tons of trouble dumped onto a farm that was already struggling. And for the first few days, they seemed to be right. The pile began to smell. Flies gathered over it. Dark liquid seeped across the ground. One neighbor shook his head and told Walter he'd probably have to pay someone to haul the mess away. But Walter didn't haul it away. He started watching it, then measuring it, then mixing it with things other people were throwing out too. 6 months later, trucks were back at Walter Hayes's gate. Only this time, they weren't coming from the brewery. They belonged to farmers. Pickup trucks, flatbed trailers, old farm rigs lined along the road before Walter had finished his morning coffee. They had all come for the same thing. Not the waste the brewery had dumped there. What the old man had learned to turn it into. Walter Hayes had learned a long time ago that the most expensive things on a farm were not always the things you paid for. Sometimes they were the things someone gave you for free. At 67, Walter had been farming long enough to distrust anything described as a bargain. Cheap seed could cost you a crop. A cheap repair could cost you a transmission. And free material usually meant someone else had already decided it was easier to give away than deal with. So when a brewery called and offered him 40 tons of wet, spent grain for nothing, Walter's first instinct was not excitement. It was suspicion. He sat at the kitchen table with one hand around a mug of coffee and the other resting beside an unopened fertilizer invoice. Outside the window, his farm looked almost exactly as it had for years. An old white house, a machinery shed with fading paint, weathered fence lines, cottonwoods moving in the wind, fields stretching beyond them. From the road, nothing looked desperate. That was the dangerous part. The farm was still producing. Walter was still planting. The tractor still started most mornings. The bills were still getting paid. Barely. But every year seemed to require more money to get roughly the same thing from the ground. More fertilizer, more fuel, more passes with equipment, more repairs. And the soil itself was becoming harder to ignore. After a heavy rain, sections of the field sealed over. During dry weather, those same places seemed to lose moisture faster than they used to. In some spots, Walter could drive a shovel several inches into the ground before the blade stopped against a compacted layer that felt almost deliberate. The farm had not failed. It was wearing out slowly, and Walter knew slow problems were often the most expensive because a man could spend years pretending they were separate problems. His son, David, had stopped pretending. For nearly 2 years, he had been telling Walter that selling the farm did not mean losing. "You've worked it your whole life," David had said one evening. "You don't have to work yourself into the ground with it." Walter had stared across the table at him. David was not that trying to take the place away. That almost made it worse. He was trying to protect his father from it. Walter understood that. He just did not agree. His father had worked those fields. Walter had spent most of his own life learning which low spots stayed wet after spring rain, which fence line caught snow in winter, which section planted early, and which one punished you for trying. You could put the acreage on paper. You could put a price on the buildings. But Walter did not know how anyone put a price on knowing a piece of ground for 50 years. So he kept farming, and the fertilizer invoices kept coming. That was why he stayed on the phone when the brewery manager called. They had a problem. Every brewing cycle left behind large quantities of wet grain after most of the sugars had been extracted. Normally, much of it went elsewhere. That week, their usual outlets could not take enough. The material was piling up. They needed it gone. The man asked if Walter could use some. Walter looked again at the invoice beside him. How much is some? There was a pause. Probably around 40 tons. Walter stopped moving. He had expected a truckload. Maybe two. Not 40 tons. That wet? Very. How soon? As soon as you can take it. Walter leaned back in the chair. He did not know exactly what 40 tons of wet brewery grain could do for his soil. He knew organic material mattered. He knew manure changed ground over time. He knew crop residue. Bedding. Leaves. Spoiled hay. Everything that had once been alive eventually became part of something else. But 40 tons was not a garden experiment. 40 tons was enough material to become a problem before a man figured out what the experiment was. Walter asked the question that mattered most. What are you charging? The man laughed. Nothing. Walter said nothing. We just need it gone. That sentence told Walter almost everything he needed to know. The brewery did not believe it was giving him something valuable. It believed Walter was solving a disposal problem. Maybe it was right. Walter looked through the kitchen window toward the lower field. Then at the fertilizer invoice. He was not desperate enough to believe free meant useful, but he was interested enough to find out. Bring it. The first truck arrived the next morning. Walter heard it before he saw it. A diesel engine came down the county road, slowed near the mailbox, then turned through the gate. The truck crossed the gravel yard and back toward the open space behind the barn. Walter stood off to one side in muddy boots. The driver climbed down. You Hayes? Walter nodded. The driver looked around the yard. Where do you want it? Walter pointed. There. The driver hesitated. All of it? Walter looked at the truck. Then at the space behind the barn. That's why you came. The bed rose. Wet grain began sliding out. At first it came slowly. Then the whole mass shifted. A heavy brown wave dropped onto the ground with a sound somewhere between mud and feed. Steam lifted faintly from the fresh material. The smell was sweet, warm, and unfamiliar enough to make Walter step closer. By the time the first truck pulled away, the pile was already larger than he had imagined. Then the second truck turned through the gate. Walter watched it come. For the first time, he wondered if he had misunderstood the number. Then the third arrived. By noon, the pile behind the barn stood higher than the hood of his tractor. 40 tons looked very different in a phone conversation. From the kitchen table. It had sounded like material. Standing beside it, Walter understood that it was volume, weight, moisture, work. A pickup slowed on the county road, then stopped. Earl Bennett leaned across the cab and stared through the open window. Earl had farmed across the road for nearly 30 years and possessed the particular talent of a man who could communicate an opinion before speaking. He looked at the pile, then at Walter. What in the hell is that? Spent brewery grain. Earl looked back at the mound. You bought that? Walter shook his head. They gave it to me. Earl was quiet for a second. That's supposed to make me feel better about it? Walter smiled. Wasn't meant to. Another pickup slowed behind Earl. Walter could already imagine the conversation moving down the road before supper. 40 tons of brewery waste had appeared behind Walter Hayes's barn. Nobody knew why, including, if Walter was being honest, Walter. Earl opened his door and stepped out. He walked a little closer to the pile. Not too close. What are you going to do with it? Walter looked at the wet grain. That was the question. He could have invented an answer. Farmers did that sometimes when neighbors were watching. Call an experiment a plan. Call uncertainty patience. Call a gamble an investment. Walter had lived too long to need the performance. Don't know yet. Earl stared at him. Walter crouched near the edge of the pile and picked up a handful. The grain was wet enough to squeeze together. Warm from the brewery process. Soft. Heavy. Nothing about it looked like fertilizer. Nothing about it looked like soil. And there was far too much of it to ignore. Earl shook his head. 40 tons and no plan. Walter let the grain fall through his fingers. I've had plans go worse. Earl laughed once, climbed back into his truck, and drove away. Walter stayed beside the pile. The yard had become quiet again. 3 trucks had entered his gate, carrying material. A brewery needed gone. They had left Walter with 40 tons of it and no instructions. No guaranteed value. No guarantee it would help his land. And no guarantee that getting rid of it later would remain free. Walter looked toward the lower field. That was the part he could not stop thinking about. Before deciding what this pile could become, he needed to be clear about the problem he was asking it to solve. He had spent years buying things for the crop: fertilizer, fuel, seed, repairs. Maybe he had been asking the wrong question. Maybe the next thing he needed to understand was not what the crop was missing. Maybe it was what the ground underneath it had been losing. Walter wiped his hand on his jeans and walked back toward the house. Behind him sat 40 tons of someone else's problem. Ahead of him sat a field that had been quietly becoming his. By sunrise, he intended to look at the field first. Before sunrise the next morning, Walter was already in the lower field. He carried a shovel, a 5-gallon bucket, and the question that had kept him awake longer than he wanted to admit: what was the ground actually losing? The 40 tons of brewery grain sat behind the barn, untouched. Walter deliberately walked past it. If that pile was going to solve anything, he needed to understand the problem first. He stopped at the section of the field that had frustrated him most the previous season. From a distance, nothing looked wrong. That was what bothered him. The farm had never collapsed. It had simply become harder to farm. Walter pushed the shovel into the soil. The first few inches broke easily. Then the blade stopped. He stepped onto it and leaned his weight down. The soil finally lifted in a hard slab. Walter turned it over. Most of the roots stayed near the surface. Few had pushed deeper. He rubbed a piece between his fingers. Years ago, this ground had behaved differently after rain. It stayed open longer, held moisture better, worked easier before planting. Now a heavy storm could seal the surface, then a week of heat could leave it hard again. Walter dug another hole 20 yards away, then another. The pattern changed from place to place. But the message did not. The farm was still growing crops. It was simply demanding more help every year to do it. More fertilizer, more fuel, more equipment passes. Walter had spent years treating those things as separate problems. Weak growth meant fertility. Hard ground meant tillage. Dry ground meant water. Standing there with a compacted clod in his hand, he wondered if he had been paying for symptoms. He dropped the sample into the bucket. By the time the sun cleared the cottonwoods, he had soil from several parts of the field. David's truck was in the yard when Walter returned. His son stood beside the barn staring at the brewery pile. "You really took all 40 tons. Walter set the bucket beside the workbench. "They really brought all 40. David looked at him. "And now what?" Walter pointed toward the bucket. "Now I figure out what I'm trying to fix." David glanced at the soil samples. Then toward the tractor. A hydraulic line was leaking again. 2 fence sections still needed replacing, and the fertilizer invoice Walter had avoided opening was still on the kitchen table. "Dad, you don't have money for a big experiment." "I know. And if that stuff turns into a problem, I know that too." David stopped. Walter looked toward the fields. "That's why I'm not spreading it. Not yet." He was not looking for another input that would feed one crop and send him another bill the following year. If all that organic material had value, Walter wanted to know whether it could help change the ground itself. And if it could not, he wanted to learn that before 40 tons disappeared into his fields. David left before noon. Later that afternoon, Walter walked behind the barn again. Something had changed. The sweet brewery smell had sharpened slightly. A few flies hovered over the mound. Walter pressed his palm against the outside. Warm. He frowned. The air was cool. He pushed his hand deeper. The warmth increased. Walter held it there. The brewery trucks had been gone barely a day, yet inside the pile, something had already started moving faster than he expected. Walter pulled his hand free and looked at the mound differently. The field had shown him one problem that morning. Now the pile was beginning to show him another. The next morning, Walter went straight to the brewery grain. He did not bring the tractor. He brought a shovel, a bucket, and his notebook. The outside of the pile looked almost unchanged. Brown grain, mid husks. A heavy mound slumped behind the barn. But when Walter pushed the shovel into the side, warm vapor lifted into the cold morning air. He leaned closer. The smell had changed again, still sweet underneath, but sharper now, more sour. Walter opened a small pocket near the center. The heat was stronger there. He wrote that down. Then he checked the outer edge. Cooler. Drear. Another note. For the rest of the morning, Walter moved around the mound without trying to fix it. He watched. Liquid was beginning to collect beneath the lowest side. The surface dried where wind reached it. The center stayed wet, and the entire pile seemed lower than it had the day before. At first, Walter assumed the weight was simply settling. Then he marked the height against a fence post. By evening, it had dropped again. Something inside the pile was consuming the material. Walter had seen manure heat. He had seen wet hay spoil. He had watched crop residue disappear into soil. Organic matter changed. That part was not new. What surprised him was how fast this grain was changing. It had already been crushed, soaked, heated, and stripped of much of what the brewery wanted. What remained was soft, wet, and easy to break down. Walter did not know every organism doing the work. He did not need to. The pile was giving him evidence. The question was whether he could learn to control it before 40 tons became 40 tons of trouble. He pulled a forkful from the edge and spread it thin across the ground. Several hours later, that material had cooled. The grain still packed in the main mound remained hot. Walter stared at the difference. Same material. Different shape. He spread another section wider. Cooler again. Then he pushed grain back into a tight heap. The heat held longer. Walter wrote 3 words in the notebook. Thickness. Air. Moisture. He circled them. For the first time, he stopped thinking of the grain as one giant pile. It was a process, and processes could be influenced. Near sunset, David found him crouched beside the mound. You planning to study that thing all night? Walter pushed the shovel into the center, trying to figure out what makes it behave. David looked at the steam rising from the opening, and Walter pulled out a dense clump. It held together like wet dough. Too early. That answer bothered him, because by the next morning, the pile was hotter, the bottom was wetter, and the sour smell had become strong enough to reach the house. Walter had finally found the process. Now it was beginning to run away from him. Chapter 4. His first attempt was a disaster. By sunrise, Walter could smell the pile before he reached the barn. The sourness from the day before had deepened into something heavier. Not the clean, earthy smell of compost. Not even the familiar smell of manure. This was sharp, wet, and unpleasant. A smell that told him the pile was no longer simply breaking down. Something inside it had gone wrong. Walter walked around the mound slowly. The surface had sunk several inches overnight. Dark liquid had collected along the lower edge and was moving toward a shallow depression in the yard. Flies gathered above the wettest section. When Walter pushed a fork into the center and pulled material aside, heat rolled out. But instead of feeling encouraged, he stepped back. The grain underneath was packed together, almost like wet dough. There were no visible spaces between particles, no structure, no air. Walter stood there for a long moment. He had spent the previous 2 days thinking the heat meant he was watching something useful begin. Now he realized that heat alone didn't mean the process was going well. He needed to do something, so he made his first real attempt. He climbed onto the tractor, fitted the loader, and began moving the pile. His idea was simple. Spread it out. Turn it. Let more air into the material. He peeled sections from the center and rebuilt them beside the original mound. For several hours, he worked back and forth. By noon, the yard was covered in smaller piles. Steam lifted every time the bucket opened one. The smell spread with it. His shirt was soaked through by the time David arrived. David parked near the gate and stayed inside his truck for several seconds before getting out. What happened? Walter shut off the tractor. Too wet. David looked across the yard. It smells like something died. Walter didn't answer. A pickup slowed on the road. Then another. By late afternoon, one of Walter's neighbors, Earl Bennett, finally pulled into the yard. Earl had farmed across the road for almost 30 years. He was the kind of man who rarely needed to say much because his face usually said it first. That afternoon, it said Walter had lost his mind. Earl stepped out, took 3 steps toward the barn, and stopped. "You planning to brew beer out here?" Walter wiped sweat from his forehead. "No." "Good. Because I think you already ruined the recipe." Walter glanced at the piles. Earl followed his eyes. "How much of this stuff did you take?" 40 tons. Earl let out a short laugh. "Free?" "Free." Earl shook his head. "That's how they got you." Walter looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means they had a disposal problem. And now you have it." For the first time since the trucks arrived, Walter had no answer. Because standing in that yard, surrounded by wet grain, flies, and runoff, Earl's explanation sounded painfully reasonable. Walter had taken something another business needed to get rid of. He had assumed the fact that it was organic meant he could turn it into something useful, but he had skipped the part in between. That evening, the smell reached the house. Walter closed the kitchen window, then opened it again 10 minutes later because the room was too warm. David sat across from him at the table. "You need to decide how much more time you're going to put into this." Walter stared at the unopened fertilizer invoice beside his coffee mug. He knew what David was really saying. The farm did not have enough money for a mistake that required another mistake to fix it. Hiring trucks to remove 40 tons would cost money. Continuing blindly could cost more. Walter looked toward the dark yard outside. For the first time, selling the place no longer felt like the only thing threatening the farm. His own experiment might be doing it too. The next morning, he went back to the pile before daylight. He took a shovel, a notebook, and a flashlight. This time, he didn't start moving anything. He wrote down what he could see. Too much moisture. Material packed tightly. Heat trapped inside. Almost no structure. Runoff underneath. Walter read the list twice. Then he stared at the grain. Maybe the problem was not that the brewery had given him worthless material. Maybe the problem was that he had been treating one ingredient as if it were the whole recipe. Walter spent most of that morning at the kitchen table. The notebook from the yard lay open beside him. Too wet. Too dense. Too hot. No structure. Runoff. He had written the same 5 problems 3 different ways. As if changing the words might somehow change the pile. It didn't. By 9 o'clock, the smell was still drifting through the screen door. Walter poured another cup of coffee and began working backward. The grain itself was not useless. That much he was no longer willing to believe. Something inside it was active enough to create heat within hours. The problem was, what happened when 40 tons of that same wet material were packed together? Walter had spent decades dealing with crop residue, manure, spoiled hay, and bedding. None of those materials behaved exactly the same. Dry straw could sit for months. Wet manure changed much faster. Wood chips lasted longer than either. He had always known that in practice, he had just never thought of those differences as parts of the same system. That afternoon, he drove behind the barn to where an old pile of straw had been sitting near the fence. Most of it was weathered. Some had gone gray. Walter pulled apart a flake. Dry inside. Light. Full of spaces. He carried a forkful back to the spent grain. Then he stopped. The brewery material slumped when he lifted it. The straw did the opposite. It held shape. Walter dropped the straw on top of a small section of grain and mixed it through by hand. Almost immediately, the texture changed. The grain no longer stuck to itself in one solid mass. Straw fibers opened pockets through it. Walter stood up. He went to the shed and found 2 old buckets. Into the first, he put only wet brewery grain. Into the second, he mixed grain with chopped straw. He did not know the right ratio. That was the point. He was no longer trying to solve 40 tons at once. He was trying to understand a few pounds. The next morning, both buckets were warm, but the mixed bucket smelled different, less sharp. It also drained differently when Walter squeezed a handful. He wrote that down. Then he tried another batch with old wood shavings left from a repair project. another with dry leaves caught along the fence line, another with a little sawdust from Earl's nephew, who cut firewood and occasionally milled rough boards. For 3 days, Walter worked with small piles instead of the mountain behind the barn. He changed one thing at a time: more dry material, less dry material, looser pile, tighter pile, more turning, less turning. He started noticing a pattern. The wet grain brought moisture and material that broke down quickly. The straw, leaves, and woodier material brought something different. They absorbed some of the excess water. They kept the pile from collapsing into a wet mass. They created spaces where air could move. And because they broke down more slowly, they changed how the whole pile behaved. Walter did not think of it as chemistry yet. He thought of it as balance. One material was too much of one thing. The other materials supplied what it lacked. On the 4th afternoon, David found him standing beside 6 small test piles arranged behind the shed. Each one had a scrap of cardboard stuck into the ground with notes written across it. David read the first, grain and straw, then the next, grain and leaves. He looked at Walter. "You making recipes now?" Walter picked up a handful from one of the piles. "Something like that?" David crouched beside him. The material was still recognizable as grain and straw, but it no longer had the same slick, compacted texture as the original pile. David smelled it cautiously. "That one's not as bad." Walter nodded. "That's the first useful thing you've said about it." David smiled. "So what changed?" Walter looked toward the huge pile behind the barn. "I kept thinking they gave me too much." He picked up a piece of dry straw. That wasn't the problem. He let it fall back into the test pile. "They gave me only half of what I needed." David waited. Walter pointed toward the wet grain. "That stuff breaks down fast. Holds too much water. Packs tight." Then he pointed to the straw. "This is dry. Opens it up. Gives the pile some body." For the first time since the trucks arrived, Walter could explain why his first attempt had failed. The answer was not to remove the brewery grain. It was to pair it with something completely different. And once Walter understood that, the farm around him began to look different too. The old straw behind the fence was no longer junk. The leaves collected in the drainage ditch were no longer something to burn. Wood chips from tree crews were no longer debris. Sawdust was no longer just a mess on somebody else's floor. All across the countryside, Walter suddenly saw dry material people were trying to get rid of. The brewery had given him 40 tons of wet waste, but Walter was beginning to understand the real opportunity. It had only given him 1/2 of a compost pile. The countryside was throwing away the other half. Once Walter understood that the brewery grain was only half the recipe, the countryside changed around him. Things he had ignored for years suddenly looked useful. Old straw behind sheds, leaves caught along fence lines, wood chips from tree crews, clean sawdust swept from small shops. None of it was valuable by itself. That was exactly what interested him. The brewery had too much wet material. Other people had too much dry material. Walter needed both. The first load came from Earl's nephew. A half-trailer of sawdust and coarse wood shavings from a portable mill. The boy had planned to burn it. Walter told him to dump it beside the barn instead. The next day, a neighbor brought several weathered straw bales that had been sitting under a lean-to for 2 years. Too poor for bedding. Too old to sell. Perfect for Walter's experiment. Then came leaves. Then a tree crew called after clearing branches along a county road. Normally they drove miles looking for somewhere to unload the chips. Walter gave them an address. By the end of the week, his yard looked worse than before. On one side sat the brewery grain dark, wet, heavy. On the other were piles of straw, leaves, sawdust, and chips light enough for the wind to move. David stood near the shed and looked from one side to the other. "You're collecting 2 kinds of garbage now." Walter climbed onto the tractor. "That's the idea." He did not mix everything at once. The first 40 tons had taught him what happened when volume moved faster than understanding. This time, he built one pile, a coarse layer underneath, then spent grain, then straw, more grain, a layer of chips, Then the loader bucket went through the whole thing until the wet mass stopped collapsing into itself. Walter climbed down and squeezed a handful, still damp, but no longer slick. He could see spaces between the fibers. He left it alone. By morning, the pile was warm. Not sewer. Warm. Walter wrote that down. The second pile was different. The straw had absorbed rain before it arrived. Walter used the same proportions anyway. By the next morning, the center had slumped and the smell had sharpened. He opened it with the loader and found the middle wetter than he wanted. More dry material. More mixing. Another note. The third pile barely heated at all. Walter had overcorrected. Too many wood chips. Too little wet grain. Another note. There was no single recipe. That realization frustrated him at first. Then it freed him. The materials were never going to arrive exactly the same. One brewery load was wetter than another. Some straw had been stored under a roof. Some had sat in rain. Sawdust behaved differently from chips. Leaves collapsed faster than either. So Walter stopped asking for a number. He started asking for signs. If a handful squeezed like mud, the pile needed more dry material. If the center collapsed into a dense mass, it needed structure. If the smell turned sharp, he opened it. If the pile stayed loose and cold, he looked again at the balance. The yard slowly stopped looking accidental. Wet material had one area, dry material another. Finished piles sat apart from fresh ones. Walter cleared enough space for the tractor to move between them without driving through the rows. David noticed it one afternoon. "You've got a system now." Walter looked across the yard. "No." David waited. Walter pointed toward the newest pile. "I've got a way to know what to change when it goes wrong." That was different. And it mattered. Because the brewery kept calling. Another load arrived before Walter had finished using the last one. Then another. For the first time, he realized the problem might not be whether the idea worked. It might be whether he could find enough dry material to keep up with it. So Walter started making calls. He did not ask people what they could sell him. He asked what they already wanted gone. That question opened doors. Old balesh. Tree chips. Leaves. Clean, untreated shavings. He accepted what he understood. He rejected anything painted, treated, contaminated, or mixed with material he could not identify. Free did not mean safe. That lesson had already cost him enough. 3 weeks later, Walter opened one of the earliest balanced piles with the loader. The material inside had darkened. Most of the grain was difficult to recognize. The straw had softened. The mixture broke apart instead of sticking together. Walter climbed down and picked up a handful. David watched from several feet away. "You're going to smell it, aren't you?" Walter ignored him. He brought the material closer. No sour brewery odor. No rotten smell. Just something dark, warm, and strangely familiar. Walter rubbed it between his fingers. For the first time, 40 tons of waste had begun to smell like soil. He looked across the rows. Making one good pile was no longer the question. Now he needed to know how to recognize a good pile before his nose told him. The next thing Walter bought was not a bigger tractor. It was a thermometer. Long stainless steel probe. Wide dial. Nothing fancy. David held the box in one hand and looked across the yard at rows of compost. "You've got all that out there. And this is what you spend money on?" Walter took the thermometer from him. Cheaper than guessing. Until then, Walter had been reading the piles with his hands, his nose, and experience. Warm meant activity. Sharp smell meant trouble. Wet clumps meant too much moisture. Loose material usually meant better air. It worked, but warm was not a number. And Walter had started noticing something that bothered him. 2 piles could feel almost the same from the outside, while behaving completely differently inside. He pushed the probe deep into the first pile. The needle climbed. Walter waited. 138 degrees. He wrote it down. The second pile read lower. The third was hotter. Walter checked the same locations the next morning. Then again the day after that. Soon, His notebook carried 4 things beside every pile: temperature, smell, moisture, structure. Patterns began to appear. One pile warmed steadily for several days, then slowly cooled. Another jumped hot almost overnight. A third barely heated at all. At first, Walter thought the hottest pile might be the best. Then he opened it. The center had settled into a dense, wet mass. The smell underneath was beginning to turn sour. Months earlier, Walter would have seen the heat as proof that everything was working. Now he understood better. Heat only meant something was happening. It did not tell him whether the pile was healthy. Walter mixed in coarse chips, opened the structure, and rebuilt the pile looser. 2 days later, the temperature had dropped slightly. The sour smell was gone. That taught him more than the number ever could. The thermometer was not giving Walter answers. It was telling him where to look. From then on, he stopped chasing a perfect temperature. He watched direction. A pile heating too fast made him check moisture and structure. A pile staying cold made him check whether it was too dry or badly balanced. A pile cooling after weeks of steady activity told him something different again. Every signal needed context. David noticed the change. Walter was no longer running toward problems after they smelled bad enough to reach the house. He was catching them earlier. One morning, David found him beside a windrow with the thermometer buried to the dial. "What's this one say?" "142. "That good?" Walter looked at the pile before answering. "No smell." He squeezed a handful. Damp, but not dripping. Then he pulled the material apart. Loose enough for air. Walter nodded. "This one's good." David smiled. "You needed all that just to say that?" Walter wiped the probe clean. "I needed all that to know why." By the 4th week, checking the piles had become part of his morning. Coffee, boots, notebook, thermometer. Earl saw him one afternoon and leaned against the fence. "You taking their temperature now?" Walter pushed the probe deeper. "Looks that way." Earl shook his head. "You used to grow crops." "Still do." Earl looked across the rows. "Could have fooled me." Walter smiled, but his attention had already moved elsewhere. One of the earliest piles had stopped heating. The material was dark, soft, crumbly. The original grain was almost impossible to identify. Walter filled 2 buckets. For weeks, he had learned how to keep 40 tons of waste from becoming a problem. Now it was time to answer the question that had started everything. Could any of this actually change the soil? Walter chose the worst part of the lower field. Not the section that would make him look smart. The section that had been frustrating him for years. It sat slightly higher than the ground around it, and dried faster after rain. By midsummer, the surface could turn hard enough that young roots struggled to push through it. If the compost could make a difference there, Walter figured it was worth paying attention to. He marked out 2 narrow strips. Same field, same soil, same weather. One would stay exactly as it was. The other would receive the finished compost from his earliest pile. David watched him spread it with the loader. "You're only doing this little section?" Walter nodded. "Don't need 40 acres to learn something." He worked the compost into the upper layer of soil and left the neighboring strip untouched. Then he waited. That was harder than making the compost. There was no steaming pile to turn. No smell to diagnose. No thermometer needle to watch. Climb. The field changed on its own schedule. For the first several days, there was almost nothing to see. Then it rained. A hard spring rain came through overnight, and dropped enough water to leave shallow puddles across the lower ground. Walter walked the field the next morning. He started with the untreated strip. Water sat in several depressions. The surface had begun sealing over in places. Then he stepped into the compost-treated strip. The difference was not dramatic. That mattered to Walter. He did not want dramatic. He wanted repeatable. The treated soil had taken in the rain a little differently. There was less standing water. The surface broke apart more easily under his boot. He crouched and dug his fingers into the top few inches. Stilvit. Still recognizable as the same field, but looser. Walter wrote it down. A week later, the weather turned dry. He checked again. The untreated strip began to harden first. On the compost side, the surface still crumbled more easily when he pressed it between his fingers. He pushed a shovel into both strips. The difference was small enough that someone driving past would never notice. Walter noticed. That was the point of the test. He was no longer asking whether compost was good. He was asking whether the soil behaved differently because of what he had done. So he kept watching. When the next crop emerged, he resisted the temptation to declare victory. Some plants always grew better than others. A patch of darker green did not prove anything by itself. Walter compared the strips over time. After rain, after dry weather, after a hot week, after another storm, he kept notes the same way he had with the compost piles. Not because he suddenly considered himself a scientist, because memory could lie. A notebook was harder to argue with. By the third week, the treated strip was holding his attention. The plants there looked more even. The soil did not crust as quickly after rain. When Walter dug down, he could work it with less effort. None of it looked miraculous. But together, the changes were consistent enough that he stopped calling them coincidence. David came down one evening and found his father kneeling between the two strips. Walter handed him a clod from the untreated side. David squeezed it. Then Walter handed him soil from the compost side. David broke it apart with his thumb. "That's softer." Walter nodded. "Been doing that all week." David looked across the field. "So it worked?" Walter stood slowly and brushed dirt from his knees. "It's working here." That answer mattered. Walter had learned too much over the previous month to turn one successful strip into a promise about every acre. Different soils behave differently. Different compost batches behave differently. Weather could change everything. But for the first time, he had evidence on his own farm that the material behind the barn could do more than stop smelling bad. It could become part of the soil, and the soil seemed to respond. Walter expanded the trial slightly, not across the whole farm, just enough to see whether the pattern continued. He applied another finished batch to a second section, then he waited again. A few days later, Earl Bennett slowed his pickup beside the field. Walter saw him looking toward the darker strip. Earl drove another 50 yards, then stopped. He backed up. Walter leaned on his shovel as Earl lowered the window. "What'd you put there?" Walter pointed toward the barn. Earl followed his finger. For several seconds, neither man said anything. Then Earl looked back at the field. "That brewery stuff? Not anymore." Earl frowned. Walter smiled. "Come back tomorrow with a trailer." "Why?" Walter pushed the shovel into the treated soil and lifted a dark, loose clod. "Because I think you should try some before you decide I'm crazy." Earl came back the next morning with a small utility trailer. Walter heard the truck before he saw it. He was near the compost rows, checking one of the older piles, when Earl pulled into the yard and parked beside the loader. For a moment, neither man said anything. Earl looked across the rows. The place no longer resembled the sour mess he had seen weeks earlier. The grain piles had become dark windrows. The worst smell was gone. The runoff was gone. Even the flies were gone. Earl stepped out and kicked at a little compost that had spilled near the edge of the lane. "This is the same stuff?" Walter nodded. "Started that way." Earl picked up a handful. He smelled it, then looked at Walter. "Doesn't smell like it." "That's the idea." Earl let the material fall through his fingers. "How much do I use?" Walter had expected that question. "I don't know your field well enough to tell you that." Earl raised an eyebrow. Walter pointed across the road. "Try a small strip. Keep another strip the way you usually do. Watch both." Earl stared at him. "That's what you did?" "That's what I'm still doing." Walter loaded enough compost to cover a modest test area. Not a full field. Not even close. Earl had expected more. "That it?" "That's enough to learn something." Earl climbed back into his truck. Before leaving, he looked toward the piles again. "You selling this now?" Walter shook his head. "Not yet." Earl laughed. "Then don't get too proud when I come back and tell you it did nothing." Walter closed the trailer gate. "I'd rather you tell me the truth." For the next 2 weeks, Walter heard nothing. He continued with his own trials. He expanded the treated area carefully. He kept checking the compost temperature. He kept rejecting fresh material that was not ready. And he kept writing everything down. Then, one evening, Earl's truck appeared at the end of the lane. Walter was repairing a fence post when Earl pulled over beside him. He did not get out. Walter rested both hands on the top wire. "Well?" Earl looked toward his own field. "I'm not saying you were right." Walter waited. Earl rubbed his jaw. "But that strip is holding moisture longer." Walter said nothing. "And the ground works easier." Still, Walter said nothing. Earl frowned. "You enjoying this?" "A little." Earl pointed toward the barn. "You got any more?" That was the first time someone had asked Walter for a second load. And that question changed something. Until then, the compost had been an experiment designed to solve Walter's problem. Now someone else had seen enough value to want it too. Walter looked toward the rows behind the barn. Some piles were nearly ready. Others were weeks away. He did not have an endless supply. And he still did not know what the material was worth. Earl followed his gaze. "I can pay." Walter turned back. "For what? The compost?" Walter almost laughed. 6 weeks earlier, Earl had told him the brewery had handed him a disposal problem. Now the same man was offering money for what had come out of it. Walter did not take the cash. Not that day. Instead, he loaded Earl another small trailer and made him promise to keep comparing the treated and untreated ground. Walter wanted proof more than he wanted a sale. But Earl was not the only person watching. Farmers noticed changes in neighboring fields. They noticed trailers entering Walter's gate. They asked Earl questions. Then they started asking Walter. By the end of that week, 3 people had called. One wanted compost for a garden. Another wanted to test it on a tired pasture. A third simply asked the question Walter had not expected to hear so soon. "How much can you make?" Walter looked out the kitchen window at the compost rows. For the first time, the problem was no longer whether anyone would want what he was making. The problem was whether he could make enough of it. The calls kept coming. Not dozens. Not enough to make Walter think he had built a business overnight. But enough that he started writing names beside the compost piles in his notebook. Earl's second trailer. Mason Garden. Holly's pasture test. Raymond call when next batch is ready. Walter stared at the list one morning and realized he had created a problem he had never expected to have. People wanted the material before it was finished. That made him nervous. The first bad brewery pile had taught him what happened when he rushed a biological process. So when a farmer offered to pick up compost that was still warm and unfinished, Walter shook his head. Not ready. The man looked at the dark pile. Looks ready. Walter pushed the thermometer into the center. The needle climbed. It isn't. How long? Walter glanced at his notes. When it tells me. The farmer laughed. But Walter did not. If people were going to put this material on their ground, he was not going to hand them something simply because it looked dark enough from the outside. That meant he needed more finished compost. And more finished compost meant he needed more ingredients. The brewery could provide wet grain. That part was easy. The difficult part was keeping enough dry. Carbon-rich material, available to balance it. Walter called the tree crew again. They had 2 truckloads of chips from a clearing job. He took both. The cabinet shop called about another pile of clean sawdust. Walter collected it. A neighboring cattle farmer had old bedding mixed with straw that had been sitting behind a shed. Walter went to look before agreeing to take it. Soon, material was arriving from several directions. The strange part was that most of the people bringing it were happy to see it disappear. Some had been burning it. Some had been hauling it away. Some had simply been piling it where it would sit for years. Walter had started by taking one business's waste. Now he was collecting waste from several, but this time, he understood what each material was doing. The brewery grain brought moisture and easily decomposed organic matter. The straw created structure and absorbed excess moisture. Wood chips helped keep the piles open. Leaves added another dry organic fraction. Not every load was useful. Walter rejected treated wood. He turned away mixed debris. He refused anything he could not identify. The lesson was becoming clearer every week. The value was not in taking everything. The value was in knowing what belonged in the system. David saw it before Walter said it aloud. One afternoon, he stood beside the barn, while 3 different loads sat waiting to be processed. Spent grain on one side, wood chips on another, old straw stacked along the fence. David pointed across the yard. "You know what this looks like?" "Oh, miss." "No." David shook his head. "It looks like a supply chain." Walter laughed. "A supply chain? You've got one place giving you wet material, 3 places giving you dry material, and farmers waiting for what comes out the other end." Walter looked across the yard again. For weeks, he had been thinking one pile at a time. Build it, watch it, turn it, finish it. But from where he stood now, the piles were only the middle. The brewery had a disposal problem. Tree crews had a disposal problem. Farmers had soil that needed organic matter. Walter was standing between all 3. That was when the shape of the whole thing finally became visible. The brewery was not simply giving him grain. The tree crew was not simply giving him wood chips. And Walter was not simply making compost. He was connecting materials that had been separated by the way local businesses worked. Something left one system as waste. It entered another system as an ingredient. Then it left Walter's farm as something useful again. Brewery, farm, soil, crop, then back through the local community. The compost pile was only the point where those pieces met. Walter opened his notebook to a blank page. Instead of temperatures, he wrote 4 words. Wet in, dry in, compost out, farms. He stared at them. For the first time, the 40 tons behind the barn no longer seemed large. They seemed like the beginning. But scale introduced new problems. Walter needed space for incoming material. He needed finished piles separated from active ones. He needed to know who was waiting and how much they wanted. Most of all, he needed enough time. There was no shortcut for that. So he marked the rows with dates. He stopped accepting more wet grain than he could balance. He began calling farmers only when a batch was actually ready. The operation became slower than demand wanted. And that was exactly what made people trust it. By the 5th month, Walter no longer had to ask whether anyone needed the compost. Farmers began calling him before he had called them. Then they began stopping by. One left an empty trailer near the barn and told Walter to fill it when the next batch was ready. Another asked if Walter could reserve a load. Earl wanted more. Then Hollis wanted more. Then Raymond called again. Walter started a waiting list on the back page of his notebook. At first there were 4 names, then 7, then 11. One evening, David picked up the notebook and read the list. "You know they're going to start showing up before you're ready." Walter took the notebook back. "They can wait." David smiled. "You think farmers are good at waiting?" Walter looked toward the gate. "No." The next morning, before Walter had finished his first cup of coffee, he heard an engine idling outside. Then another, and another. Walter set his coffee down and walked to the window. A pickup was stopped just inside the gate. Behind it sat another truck pulling a flatbed trailer. Then a third vehicle turned off the county road. Walter stared for a moment. David had been right. They had come early. By the time Walter stepped outside, Earl was already climbing out of his truck. "You open?" Walter looked at him. "It's 6:30 in the morning." Earl shrugged. "That sounds like farmer hours." The man behind him laughed. Walter recognized him from a phone call 2 days earlier. Another farmer he barely knew stood beside the third truck. Looking toward the finished compost rows, Walter pulled on his jacket. "You all know there's only one batch ready today." Earl pointed behind him. "That's why we got here first." Within 20 minutes, 2 more trucks appeared. Then, another trailer. By 7 o'clock, vehicles stretched from Walter's yard toward the gate. Not a traffic jam, not dozens of people, but enough that Walter had to stand still for a second and look at what was happening. 6 months earlier, 3 trucks had entered that same gate, carrying something nobody wanted. Now farmers were waiting to leave with what it had become. Walter climbed onto the loader. He had already marked the finished pile the night before. It had cooled. The original grain was no longer recognizable. The straw had broken down. The material was dark, crumbly, and stable enough that Walter was willing to send it off the farm. He drove the bucket into the pile. Earl backed his trailer into place. Walter dumped the first load. A dark cloud of fine material rolled from the sides. Earl climbed down and rubbed some between his fingers. Funny. What? Earl looked toward the part of the yard where the first brewery pile had sat. First time I saw this place, I thought you'd have to pay somebody to haul that mess away. Walter lowered the loader bucket. You told me that. I remember. So do I. Earl smiled. Then he handed Walter an envelope. Walter looked at it. What's this? Payment. Walter did not reach for it immediately. Earl pushed the envelope toward him. I'm not taking another trailer for free. That moment felt stranger to Walter than the line of trucks. Until then, money had been mostly theoretical. A few people had offered. Walter had avoided thinking too far ahead. He had been more interested in whether the process worked than what the finished compost was worth. But Earl was no longer asking for an experiment. He was asking for a product. Walter took the envelope. The next farmer pulled forward. Then the next. Each one wanted something slightly different. One had a pasture that had been thinning. Another had a vegetable plot where the soil crusted badly. A third wanted only enough for a test strip. Walter gave all of them the same warning. Don't treat it like magic. He pointed toward one farmer's trailer. Try it where you can compare it. Watch what happens. The man nodded. Walter had no interest in promising that one load of compost would fix every field. The farm had taught him the opposite. Soil was local. Weather mattered. Application mattered. Time mattered. What he could sell was the material, not a miracle. That distinction mattered to him. By mid-morning, the finished row was visibly smaller. Walter stopped loading before it was empty. A farmer farther back in line walked up. That it? That's it for today. There's another pile right there. Walter shook his head. Not ready. It looks the same. Walter picked up the thermometer leaning against the shed. Looks aren't enough. The farmer looked disappointed. But Walter did not change his answer. 6 months earlier, pressure had almost convinced him to treat waste like finished compost. He was not going to repeat the same mistake now just because people were willing to pay. So he wrote the man's name in the notebook. Then another. Then another. The waiting list grew. David arrived just before noon. He slowed as he came through the gate and stared at the remaining trucks. When he stepped out, Walter was standing beside the loader with his notebook open. David looked at the line, then at his father. You remember what you said when I asked what the plan was? Walter closed the notebook. No. You said you were figuring it out. Walter looked across the yard, at the brewery grain waiting under cover, at the wood chips stacked along the fence, at the active compost rows, at Earl's truck disappearing down the road with a full trailer. I still am. David smiled. But Walter understood something now that he had not understood when the first trucks arrived. The brewery had never handed him a finished opportunity. It had handed him a problem. The value had come from learning what the problem needed in order to become something else. And now the people who had once watched 40 tons of waste arrive through Walter's gate were lining up to take that transformation home. 2 days later, another brewery truck came through Walter's gate. He heard the brakes before he saw it. The driver backed toward the receiving area, raised the bed, and another load of wet spent grain slid onto the ground. Walter stood beside the barn and watched it fall. 6 months earlier, that sound had made him nervous. Back then, all he could see was volume, weight, moisture. A problem large enough to become expensive if he handled it badly. Now he looked at the pile differently. He saw how wet it was. He thought about how much dry material he had on hand. He checked the space in the active rows. He thought about which piles were finishing, which ones needed turning, and which farmers were still waiting. The grain itself had not changed. Walter had. David came up beside him. Still looks like a lot. Walter nodded. It is. You worried? Walter looked toward the wood chips stacked along the fence, then toward the old straw under cover, then toward the rows of compost stretching behind the barn. No. The answer surprised David. Walter smiled. I know what it needs now. That was the difference. The brewery had never given Walter fertilizer. It had never given him finished compost. It had never given him a business. It had given him one difficult material in the middle of a much larger system. The rest had come from observation, from mistakes, from figuring out what the wet grain lacked, from learning that one person's waste could become useful only when it was matched with the right process, the right materials, and enough time. Walter walked toward the new pile and pushed his hand into it. Still warm, just like the first load. For a moment, he remembered standing in the same yard months earlier, while neighbors slowed their trucks to stare. He remembered the sour smell, the flies, the runoff, Earl telling him the brewery had handed him a disposal problem. In a way, Earl had been right. It had been a disposal problem. Walter had simply learned that a problem did not stay a problem when someone understood what belonged on the other side of it. Behind him, the phone inside the house began to ring. Probably another farmer asking about the next finished batch. Walter did not hurry to answer. He stood there another moment, looking at the fresh grain. Then he glanced across the yard at the thermometer leaning against the shed, the notebook beside the loader, the piles of carbon waiting along the fence, the compost rows beyond them, and the tire tracks leading through the gate. 6 months earlier, the brewery thought it had given an old farmer 40 tons of waste. Walter knew better now. It had given him half of a system. The rest had been lying around him all along.